So we're going to go right on to our next presenter, Dr. Daniel Karp. Danny Karp's an assistant professor in the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at UC Davis. His interests center on developing innovative methods for harmonizing food production with the conservation of ecosystem services and biodiversity. He works extensively with interdisciplinary teams of scientists and practitioners to synthesize science and to guide policy. He has a lot of interesting articles, and titles of a couple of them are Unintended Ecological and Social Impacts of Food Safety Regulation on the Central Coast of California, and Co-Managing Agriculture for Nature Conservation and Food Safety. He presented last year at the Center for Produce Safety at their safety symposium, and I listened to that. It was a really interesting talk about suppressive soil bacteria that regulate pathogens. So with that, I'll go ahead and let Danny take over. Thanks, Danny.
Cool. Thanks so much, Pam, for having me, and thanks all of you for coming today. I'm really excited to kind of share some of the work that we've been doing in the Central Coast surrounding food safety, conservation, co-management strategies. And so I guess a lot of this all started following that 2006 E. coli outbreak that most of us in the room or in the virtual room are familiar with. When that outbreak happened, there became a lot of concern about wildlife bringing these foodborne pathogens onto farm fields. And since then, there's been lots of effort on behalf of the industry to improve food safety and potentially dissuade wildlife from coming onto farm fields. So we've seen a lot of things happening. We've seen rodent traps going along the edges of farm fields, lots of fencing going up. Much of the Salinas River is now fenced. And then the thing that we're going to talk about today is this vegetation removal. So in a subsequent study we did a few years later, back in 2016, we found that of around 600 California produce growers, 40% of them were continuing to remove vegetation around their farm field in an effort to create these bare ground buffers and improve food safety. And we know that this has had a big impact on the riparian vegetation in the Central Coast of California. So the kind of groundbreaking study that was done initially was by Sasha Jennett of the Nature Conservancy back in 2013, and they used aerial imagery to look at much of the Salinas kind of river valley area and identify all these areas that were cleared for food safety kind of concerns. And so when she did that, she showed that about 13% of the remaining riparian habitat was cleared between the years of 2005 and 2009. That's 3 years post-outbreak. We've subsequently done more kind of aerial analysis and shown that a lot of this has continued to be cleared not only along the Salinas River, but also in other areas kind of throughout the Central Coast of California, a lot of non-crop vegetation in riparian areas and in non-riparian areas as well. So that leads us to ask basically two questions that I'm going to try and cover today. So first, is all of that habitat removal actually making our food safer? So what is the impact of habitat removal on foodborne pathogens? That'll be the first thing we talk about. And then what are the broader consequences of habitat removal? I want to think not only about kind of conservation issues, but much more about crop production and the impacts of habitat removal on pest control in particular. I do a lot of work on agricultural pests. And we'll think about that in the context of both strawberries and lettuce. So let's start off though with this question about whether habitat removal is actually making our food safer. So the first time that I kind of entered this study system and started working was as a postdoc when I was working with UC Berkeley back in 2014, 2015. And to get at that question, what we did was we worked with the fresh produce industry to get access to a lot of samples and a lot of tests of foodborne pathogens in leafy greens. So we got access to a data set of about 240,000 tests at 74 farms throughout the Central Coast of enterohemorrhagic E. coli and salmonella in leafy greens collected from the year 2007 to 2013. We also collected a couple other data sets, indicator E. coli in water, wells and waterways and farms. That's about 7,000 tests at more than 400 farms. And remember, this is generic E. coli. So this is not necessarily the kind of E. coli that gets you sick, unlike the other two pathogens above. But maybe it correlates with enterohemorrhagic E. coli. That's sort of up in the air in the food safety literature. And then finally, we have a smaller sort of academic scale study of 800 tests in salmonella and rodents at 9 farms. And the simplest thing that we could do was simply look at the locations of where these samples were collected from, and then ask, what's the habitat like in the landscape surrounding these samples? How much of it is cropland or potentially grazed land by cattle or riparian areas, other types of natural habitats? And if you have more of those different types of habitats, are you more likely to see a sample testing positive? So let's look what we found. Well, the first thing that we looked at was the enterohemorrhagic E. coli in the leafy greens. And here you can see the effects of different habitat types. So this is the effect of cropland here in orange, the effect of grazable land in brown, and then the effect of riparian areas and other natural habitats. And if these points are kind of the mean effects, and if they're above this line, then that says that there's a positive effect. So for grazable land, what we see is this kind of positive relationship, where if you increase the amount of grazable land, area that likely has cattle on it, within kind of 1.5 kilometers of where that sample came from, the likelihood a sample test positive for EHEC is much more likely. It goes from nearly 0 to over 1% likelihood. So that's a very strong, significant result. But if you look at the riparian habitat or other types of natural habitat, if anything, the relationship is going to be negative, although not significantly so. And when you look at the other things like generic E. coli and water, we found no significant relationships there with the landscape kind of surrounding. And then if we look at the salmonella in the leafy greens or in the rodents, we also didn't see any significant effects. So the kind of takeaway from here was that the kind of ungrazed semi-natural habitat in the surrounding landscape was not associated with higher pathogen prevalences, whereas the grazed lands were. And that makes a lot of sense. We know that E. coli came out of animal feedlots, and this kind of relationship is something we see a lot in the food safety literature. But one of the questions I often get asked here is like, okay, that's at the landscape scale. What was the effect of actually removing that habitat immediately around the farms? And because our data set was temporal, we could answer that kind of question. And the way we could do that is we could simply go back to our aerial imagery and we could quantify how much habitat was removed. So here you can look at a farm here and you can see all of this area that was cleared for food safety reasons along the edges of these farms. And so we could quantify how much habitat was removed and then what the change in those pathogens were over time. And so we actually found an interesting relationship here. Oh, this is a funny, I don't know why it's popping up in this weird way. It didn't do it before, but I'll just describe this graph because it's all black and weird. But on the x-axis here, we have the amount of habitat removal. So over here, we've got a lot more habitat removal, and on the right, we've got a lot less, okay? And on the y-axis, we've got the change in E. coli in leafy greens. So you can see here as you kind of go up here, there's farms that experienced an increase in enterohemorrhagic E. coli over time. And so we found this interesting relationship here where as you clear more and more habitat moving to the left-hand side of this graph, you actually saw an increase in enterohemorrhagic E. coli. You didn't see a decline, you saw an increase. And you might look at this point up here and think, oh, it's maybe just driven by this farm. If you remove that, it's still a significant relationship, but there's still a lot of scatter here. So the way that I like to interpret this graph is simply to say that it's hard for me to tell you that adding more habitat is beneficial for sure, but certainly we don't see a positive relationship here, which is what we might have wanted to expect. If you were actually removing that habitat, hoping that you would experience a decline or less of a risk of foodborne pathogens, we actually saw the opposite here. So habitat removal was associated with an increase in EHEC. So that was some of the early work I did. After that, I was more interested in kind of thinking a little bit more directly about the wildlife, right? So what are the role of the vegetation in promoting wildlife disease vectors? None of that work before was actually looking at the things that the farmers were concerned about, which was these wildlife coming onto the farm fields and moving these pathogens around the landscape. So what happens when we look at the wildlife themselves? And for many farmers, birds are of particular concern because they can't be fenced. So here's a quote from one farmer from one of our interviews that we conducted. They said that the thing that worries me more actually are birds. You can't control birds and they constantly like flying over your fields. They come and they sit in the field and they carry salmonella. So we decided we would do a bunch of studies related to the role of birds on farms, and in particular, their impacts on kind of food safety risks. And so the first thing that we wanted to do was get together a bunch of literature. So put some of the stuff that we were doing on our farms together with other studies across the Western US. And we managed to amass some really cool data sets. We got a data set of over 11,000 tests of pathogenic E. coli, salmonella, and Campylobacter, another kind of foodborne pathogen, collected across 92 produce farms in the Western US, all from 94 bird species. So these are studies where the authors here, there were 5 different studies here, they would go out, they would catch the birds, they would collect their poop, and then they would test them for these different pathogens. And across all those studies, we found that only 0.2% of the birds tested positive for STEC, 0.5% tested positive for salmonella. So really, 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 really low rates of prevalence of those 2 pathogens. But Campylobacter was a lot more common. 8% of the birds that were captured tested positive for Campylobacter, which brought us to this question, all right, so birds might not be carrying E. coli that much or salmonella that much on produce farms, but they certainly are carrying Campylobacter. So what happens if you kind of remove habitat around your farm fields? What would the impact be of that on birds and coming onto the farm and bringing this Campylobacter on? And so the way that we could get at that question was ask, all right, if we catch a bird on a farm and we then test it to see if it has Campylobacter, is that likelihood of having Campylobacter going to be different if that farm has habitat around it or not? And we actually found another interesting result here, where as you increase the amount of habitat, any kind, any semi-natural non-crop vegetation around the farm, here on the x-axis, we saw that the probability of that bird testing positive for Campylobacter declined, okay? And so we've seen this in our study. And we actually, there was another study that was just published last year, and actually still in 2021, that found the exact same result across different farms in the Western US. So it's not just our work that is finding this, that as you increase the amount of habitat around a farm field, birds are less likely to test positive for Campylobacter. We also didn't see any effect. We did a bunch of surveys where we were going just quantifying how often we saw feces in the field, and we didn't see any effect of either kind of diversification practices like hedgerows or the habitat surrounding the farm. Didn't see any effect of that on fecal densities. So what might be going on here is that the birds that are most likely to carry these diseases are the ones that are able to really thrive in these intensive landscapes that don't have habitat. So birds like those starlings or blackbirds that form big flocks. So if anything, retaining surrounding non-crop vegetation decreased these food safety risks from birds. So this has been really narrowly focused in on the Central Coast. And one of the other things we were interested in doing was sort of broadening our view a little bit and looking at what the whole kind of food safety literature has to say about these topics. Not only just about habitat removal, but about on-farm practices more generally. So we got some funding from the Center for Produce Safety to do what's called an evidence synthesis project, where you go out and you collect as much of the scientific literature as you can, sort through it, and then in a standardized way, assess it. And so our initial search looking for any paper published in any kind of journal related to food safety and on-farm practices turned up about 2,500 papers. Now, a lot of that was garbage. They maybe mentioned food safety, but didn't actually study it. And so we had to winnow that down to the studies that actually were on a farm looking at a particular practice. So we read all of the abstracts and titles, narrowed that down to 163 papers, then did more in-depth reading and got it down to 67 papers that actually were testing for impacts of on-farm practices. And we got 67 papers that were kind of arrayed in 4 different categories related to soil management, non-crop vegetation management, wildlife and domestic animal management, and landscape context. And here I've listed the number of papers that we were able to kind of summarize and assess, and the number of practices that are in these broad categories. So an example of a practice would be like adding hedgerows to a field or adding riparian fencing in, things like that. Now, this is a ton of content and a really, really big project, so I don't have time to kind of go through all these papers. But what I can do is pull out some of the studies here that are relevant to the topic at hand about this non-crop vegetation management. And the first thing that I'd like to say is there wasn't any study that we managed to find in any of them that showed that habitat removal was a good thing from a food safety perspective. There wasn't a single one that showed that habitat removal maybe reduced pathogen prevalence or reduced pathogen survival or things like that. On the contrary, we had studies like this one by Strawn et al. Published back in 2013 that showed that adding these vegetated buffers, like Paula was talking about, significantly reduced the likelihood of detecting salmonella in New York produce fields. There was a study that was published just last year by Glaze et al. That experimentally kind of installed these vegetated buffers here, bigger tree lines and things like that, and on an experimental farm, and showed that it reduced the risk of transmission of Salmonella and E. coli from the adjacent animal operation to the produce farm. And then back in California, there was a study that was published a few years ago in 2018 by Sellers et al. That was looking at hedgerows and trying to see the impact of them. And they showed that hedgerows did not increase the likelihood that rodents would intrude into walnut orchards or tomato fields or the kind of prevalence of pathogens within those rodents. So all of that is just kind of to say that it's the kind of findings that we've been seeing in the Central Coast are jiving with a lot of the other studies that are popping up across the US. So that covers the first part of the equation. Is habitat removal making our food safer? And I would say so far the evidence says no, it isn't. But what are the broader implications of that habitat removal? And for this, I want to talk about two different studies. The first one is going to be on strawberries. And I really want to highlight two amazing people that did a lot of this work: Alyssa Olympia, a postdoc who was working with me, and Karina Garcia, a PhD student at the University of Kentucky. And when we think about the impact, again, of birds and strawberries and non-crop vegetation, one of the things we might think about is this fecal contamination, and we've talked about that so far. But we know that birds also have other impacts. We know birds might eat those strawberries themselves and act as pests. But birds might provide us with benefits. They might control the insects like Lygus asperis that really damage our strawberries. Or the story might get even more complicated than that. Birds might eat the beneficial bugs like this big-eyed bug or spiders or things that really control those insect pests. So there are many, many different roles that birds might be playing on these farms. And so what we wanted to know was, if you manage your farm differently, if you have different amounts of habitat around your farm or diversification practices like hedgerows or planting multiple crops within your farm, what does that do to the bird community and what impact does that have on their impact on your crops? And so we selected 20 different organic strawberry farms to work on that varied in the amount of habitat surrounding them and the diversification practices on our farm. And the first thing that we did was go out to these farms and put up nets along the edges of them. And then we would catch birds. Here you can see a bird ran into our net, and we would take it out of this net, and we would put it in these sterilized cloth bags and walk it back to this station where we would measure it and identify it and everything like that. But the birds would get a little bit nervous when they would go in these bags, and they would leave us a nice present. They would leave us a nice poop right in that bag. And then we could take that, put it in a vial, and then we could actually look for the DNA of insects, of plant, of bacteria in that poop to try and figure out both what that bird was eating and whether it was carrying bacteria. So that gets us back to the stuff that I already presented about those foodborne pathogens. But we could also figure out what those birds were eating, the insects, the plants, things like that. We collected over 1,000 feces, so 1,000 different birds from 50 different species across the Central Coast. And we found a lot of them were doing a lot of beneficial things. So here are just a smattering of a few of the birds. There's a lot of other ones as well that were eating the primary pest of strawberry here, Lygus asperis. Lots of them were eating that pest. But in all of the poop of all of those species, we also found strawberries. So birds were not only eating those insects, they were also eating the strawberries themselves. And so if we want to know what their impact then is, we need to figure out what happens if birds are around or not around. And to do that, we need to do an experiment. And so we would do experiments where we would exclude birds from farms with these cages here. And then we would compare what happens when birds can't get in to access these strawberries with these open frame areas right next door which were open and allowed the birds to come in. And then we would monitor them for berry damage and insect abundance. And we did this both in kind of the early season and then later along in the season as well. So we found that insects were damaging way more berries than birds. Insects were way more of a problem than birds overall. But when you look at the net effect of birds, we found they were slightly negative. So they were doing slightly more harm than good, overall causing about a 3.5% loss in strawberry yield relative to kind of when birds were present versus when they're absent. And that's likely because birds were both damaging the strawberries, eating it directly, and consuming beneficial insects like those like big-eyed bugs and things like that. But what happens when we compare the different farms? Well, we found that birds were actually way less likely to consume strawberries on farms that had more habitat around them. We found that via two ways. We detected less strawberry DNA in their poops, and we also saw fewer signs of bird damage on the farms with more strawberries, with more surrounding habitat. So here's a sign of damage right here. You can see that a bird was pecking at a strawberry here, flicking it around onto the plastic mulch. So when on our transects, we would see a lot less signs of that damage. Also, we found that there were more bird species, including species of conservation concern, on the farms with more habitat around. So if you care about birds from a conservation perspective, then having more birds, having more habitat around is a good thing. What about the rest of the things that they were doing, like consuming pests and beneficial insects? Well, interestingly, we found that both pests and beneficial insects were more likely to turn up in bird poop on farms that had less habitat around them compared to farms that had more habitat around them. So it looked like birds were basically doing more on these farms that had less habitat around them. They were eating more strawberries, they were eating more bugs, and those were the beneficial ones and the pest ones. And what's really cool, though, is we can use our experiments to actually pose some hypothetical situations. So if we've got this farm right here that has habitat around it, we can use all of our data to model the cost impact of birds and show that across the farm, it's slightly negative. We had birds like this spotted towhee here moving around this farm, eating both beneficial bugs and pest bugs and some strawberries, and all of that sort of balanced out to have a slight negative impact. But when we look at a farm that doesn't have that much habitat around it, we see a very different thing going on, where at the edges of the farms, we have birds like this house finch that were really damaging a lot of the strawberries, hammering it really hard and causing a big cost impact. But in the center of the farm field, we had birds like this barn swallow flying around and eating a lot of the pests and causing a net positive. So we can then pose hypothetical situations. We can say, all right, what if we added habitat around this farm? What would happen? And we found that there would be about a 25% cost decrease if you were to add habitat to this farm. And we found that there would be a 75% cost increase if you were to take away the habitat from this farm. So this is all to say that having more habitat around would change that net impact of birds and cause it to become more positive and less of a cost. All right, and so I want to briefly say a little bit about another study that we did related to lettuce, if people are concerned about leafy greens and other impacts and not just strawberries. And for this study, what we were interested again was some of the kind of pest impacts around farm fields and what happens when you have habitat and don't. So we found a bunch of farmers willing to work with us across the Central Coast. Here they are, all the way kind of arrayed across the Central Coast. And we decided that we would grow plots of lettuce on these farms. So we had little plots of lettuce that we roped off and we were growing. And then we conducted another one of these cage experiments where we were trying to look at what the impact this time was of insects, beneficial insects, things like hoverflies and ladybugs and things like that. What the impacts of those are on aphids, aphid infestations on our lettuce, and then how that impact might change if you had habitat around, like this farm that has some riparian habitat or this one that has some oak woodland, versus farms that didn't have habitat nearby. So one of the things that we found, there was a lot in this study, I'm just going to show a little bit here. One of the things that we found was as you increase the amount of habitat around the farm here, this semi-natural non-crop vegetation, again on the x-axis here. The number of aphids that we were finding in the lettuce heads declined from, around 100 to around 10 in a given lettuce head, was what our models predicted. And when we look at this exclusion experiment where we would compare areas where predators like these ladybug beetle larvae or other types of things could get access to those aphids versus they couldn't, we found that if you look at the kind of final numbers of aphids and develop an indicator of how much biocontrol there was based on how much aphids there were in this area that's open to predators and this area that's closed, we find that there was more biocontrol, more eating of these aphids as you increased that habitat around the farm field. So all of this is to tell us that maybe having more habitat around is beneficial, not only for kind of mitigating bird costs on strawberries, but also increasing the control of insects by other insects. So pest control increased more on these farms with more habitat around them. So kind of to conclude all of the stuff that I've gone over so far, our work in the Central Coast to date suggests that habitat removal is not so effective from a food safety perspective and might even increase habitat or pathogen prevalence and food safety risk. We can say there's no evidence out there to date that shows that it improves food safety. I haven't turned that up in any of the kind of literature reviews that we've found, and we certainly didn't see that. And it might even make things a little bit worse, but that the jury is still a little bit more out on that second part. We also know that it reduces both insect and bird biodiversity. So for people concerned about conservation, habitat does matter for that reason. And we see some evidence that it's compromising that natural pest regulation and maybe even increasing some extra costs from birds or from insect pests related to damage. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge the co-authors and field assistants that worked on this. There's been an amazing group of growers and landowners that have been participating in this study, some of them in the room today. And then we've got a really wonderful set of funders, USDA, NSF, Center for Produce Safety as well, the Nature Conservancy, that I'd like to acknowledge. And so now I'd like to thank you guys for listening. And I think we've got some time for question and answer right now as well. So thank you guys.
Thank you, Danny. You covered a lot of ground there. That was really wonderful information and a lot to digest. So terrific presentation. Here's one question for you. Have you presented any food to any food safety personnel at the local shippers?
Yeah, so some of the kind of buyers, shippers have been a bit harder to get in the room. I presented this kind of stuff at a variety of different forums, certainly to academics, but that doesn't really matter. The academics, that's like screaming in an echo chamber. But we talk a lot at grower forums. There's been a lot of grower field days that we've done, some more grower-oriented conferences like at EcoFarm. We've had a lot of individual meetings with some larger organizations. I don't want to kind of name them and call them out here. And I presented some of this stuff in the past to the Central Coast Water Control Board and other venues as well. But I think that, yeah, continuing to speak more with auditors and buyers is a really important direction for this.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think so too. I think it'd be great if we could have another presentation and try to bring more of that audience to the webinar. So here's a question. I think it was directed toward you, Paula. Is irrigation required to maintain vegetated practices?
So the answer is really that depends. Right now, since we're in a drought condition, there will definitely be a need, I think, to provide supplemental irrigation to get the plants established. But in general, what we see is that once they get established, even in drought conditions, they'll survive. And that's, of course, only applicable for permanent vegetation, right? So I think with the drought, you might have to extend the supplemental irrigation, but eventually you should be able to go without it.
Okay. And then here's another question, I think, to you, Danny. Is the Nature Conservancy or other large partners able to amplify and direct this information to the big buyers who drive many of the food safety measures?
Yeah, so especially when the initial stuff came out, like that study back in 2015, that was in partnership with the Nature Conservancy. And we were doing a lot at that point. So there were several phone calls and things that we were having. We developed some press releases and then also some kind of brief policy fact sheets that we were giving out and trying to get out the word. Since then, I'm not sure how much TNC is continuing to kind of be really involved in this. A lot of the subsequent work hasn't been as much with them. So I think that there's appetite for some of these organizations at different time periods, and that might be kind of shifting over time.
Okay, and here's another question. Thank you. You did a literature review that did not turn up any studies that showed that habitat and vegetation removal increased food safety. How many publications were reviewed during your literature review?
Oh, so yeah, the way to do these kinds of things is you start super broad and then you narrow in. So you cast a really wide net. It was 2,500 studies that were papers was the first cut, but then so many of those are really irrelevant and not even having to do with food safety when you're doing these searches. And so you start narrowing down and you get, I think we got to like 170 that were potentially relevant and then beyond, and then those got more in-depth reading, and then some of those weren't after that in-depth reading, and so we further narrow. So in the end, it was like 67 papers that were actually evaluating on-farm practices. But beyond that, in kind of my work on this for years now, and in talking with a lot of other colleagues in who work in kind of the food safety realm, I've never heard of any study that's come out that has shown that habitat removal actually increases food safety. So if anyone in the room knows of anything like that, I'm always itching to find something like that, but I've never found anything myself.
Okay, thank you.